"Your father left you nothing but the clothes on your back," my mother sneered, waving a deed she claimed he signed on his deathbed. What she didn't know was that I had hidden a nanny cam in the hospice room, and it recorded her forcing my dying father's thumb onto the ink pad with his last breath. Welcome to Hidden Secrets. Before we reveal how a digital ghost destroyed a lifelong web of lies, I want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe that greed should never come before family, hit that subscribe button to join our community. My name is Juniper, and I grew up in the kind of affluent, manicured suburb of North Dallas, where the lawns are perpetually green and the secrets are buried under layers of expensive limestone. My father, Elias, was a self-made titan in the Texas oil and gas industry, a man of rugged integrity who spent his life building a legacy worth $40 million. He was my North Star, the man who taught me that a person's word was their bond. But my mother, Celeste, and my older brother, Sterling, were carved from a different, much colder stone. Celeste was the quintessential trophy wife who had transitioned into a social matron, obsessed with her standing in the Highland Park social circles. Sterling was her carbon copy, an Ivy League dropout with a penchant for high-stakes gambling and a massive chip on his shoulder because I, the younger sister, was the one who actually inherited our father's business acumen. The inciting incident occurred in the humid, oppressive heat of late August, inside the hushed, sterile walls of our family estate's sunroom, which had been converted into a private hospice suite for my father. He had been battling a terminal illness for months, and as his light began to flicker, the shadows in our house grew longer and more predatory. I had been his primary caregiver, sitting by his side through the grueling nights, whispering our favorite memories from camping trips in Big Bend while Celeste was out at charity galas, and Sterling was networking at underground poker rooms in Austin. On the night my father finally passed, the atmosphere wasn't one of grief, it was a calculated, chilling efficiency. I was in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee to stay awake for the final vigil when I heard the heavy thud of the sunroom doors closing. When I entered 10 minutes later, my father was gone, but his hand, the hand that used to ruffle my hair, was resting on a stack of legal documents. The betrayal was formalized 48 hours later at the reading of the will in a glass-walled office in downtown Dallas. The air was frigid, the air conditioning humming with a mechanical indifference. Celeste sat across from me in a custom-tailored black veil, looking like a grieving queen, while Sterling smirked, tapping a rhythmic beat on the mahogany table with his gold Rolex. Our family attorney, a man who had been on my father's payroll for 30 years, looked visibly shaken as he pushed a document toward me. "Juniper," he whispered, "your mother has presented a codicil and a series of property transfers signed just 3 hours before your father's passing. It effectively transfers all real estate holdings, the family trust, and 90% of the corporate shares to Sterling. You've been granted a small lifetime annuity, provided you vacate the Dallas estate within 30 days. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, physical numbness spreading from my chest to my fingertips. My father had told me repeatedly that I was to take over the firm. He had described the trust he set up for me as a fortress for my future. The signature on the paper was a jagged, messy version of his name, but at the bottom was something even more haunting, a dark, blurred purple smudge of a thumbprint. He wanted to ensure the Thorne name stayed in capable hands, Celeste said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. He realized at the end that a woman's place isn't in the oil fields, Juniper. It's time you found a quiet life elsewhere. The environmental details of that moment are etched into my brain. The smell of Celeste's expensive, woody perfume that seemed to overwrite the scent of my father's life, the way the Dallas skyline looked like a cage through the window, and the realization that my own mother had spent my father's final moments not saying goodbye, but harvesting his identity. I was being evicted from my own life by the people who were supposed to love me most. The 30-day countdown to my exile felt like living in a psychological thriller where the villains were eating breakfast just down the hall. For the first week, I was paralyzed, moving through the cavernous rooms of our estate like a ghost in a house that no longer recognized me. Celeste and Sterling didn't even have the decency to pretend to mourn. Within 72 hours of the funeral, Sterling had invited a group of his degenerate, investor friends over to drink my father's vintage 1945 Macallan and smoke cigars in the sunroom, the very place where my father had drawn his last breath. Their arrogance was a physical presence in the house, a thick, suffocating layer of entitlement. Sterling would walk past me in the hallway and whistle, or make comments about how he was going to turn my private library into a gaming suite with a built-in bar. He viewed the world as a game he had already won, and he viewed me as a bug that had finally been swiped off the board. Celeste's personality was even more chilling. She was the architect of the silence. She spent her days on the phone with interior designers and real estate agents, talking about purging the old energy from the house. She treated me with a distant, sugary pity that was more insulting than an open slap. "You really should look into those condos in Plano, Juniper," she told me one morning, her eyes fixed on a catalog of $20,000 chandeliers. "It's much more your speed. Quiet, simple, away from the pressures of a real estate." The internal emotional struggle I faced was a storm of grief and white-hot fury. I felt like I was losing my mind. Had my father really changed his mind? Had I been so blind to his true feelings? The gaslighting was so profound that I began to doubt my own memories of our late-night talks about the company's future. But then, I would see the way Sterling looked at the legal documents, with a greedy, nervous twitch, and I knew. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening, a night when the Texas humidity felt heavy enough to drown in. I was in the sunroom, trying to find a small porcelain clock my father had promised me, when I saw Sterling and Celeste huddled in the corner. They didn't see me behind the tall, velvet curtains. Sterling was holding the purple ink pad, laughing as he wiped a smudge of ink off the edge of the sunroom's marble side table. "I can't believe the old man actually stayed still long enough for the third one," Sterling chuckled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. I thought his hand was going to twitch and ruin the deed to the Houston refinery. Celeste didn't scold him. She just smiled, a cold, shark-like expression, and adjusted her pearls. "It doesn't matter now, Sterling. Dead men don't testify. Just make sure you burn the practice sheets. Juniper is smart, but she's emotional. She'll be out of the house by the weekend." Hearing those words was like a lightning strike to my soul. The grief vanished, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. They hadn't just stolen the money, they had desecrated his body. They had used his cooling flesh as a rubber stamp for their greed. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance, I was fighting for my father's dignity. My internal struggle ended right there. I stopped being the emotional daughter and became the forensic analyst my father had trained me to be. I remembered something that Celeste, in her technical illiteracy, had completely overlooked. 6 months prior, when my father first became bedridden, he had become paranoid about the hospice nurses stealing his medication. He had asked me to install a nanny cam, a high-definition, motion-activated camera disguised as a premium air purifier sitting on the corner of his dresser. I waited until they went out for a celebratory dinner at an upscale steakhouse in Uptown. My heart was hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I crept into the sunroom. The air still smelled faintly of sterile cleaning fluid and Sterling's cigar smoke. I grabbed the air purifier and took it back to my room, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely plug the SD card into my laptop. I scrolled through hours of footage, days of me reading to him, nights of him sleeping fitfully, and then I found it. The timestamp was 1:14 a.m. on the night he died. The video was high definition. It showed Celeste and Sterling entering the room. It showed Sterling holding my father's limp, unresponsive hand. It showed Celeste holding the ink pad. It showed them pressing his thumb onto the documents 3 separate times, while my father lay there, eyes closed, barely breathing. The psychological impact of watching that footage was a physical blow to my stomach. I had to muffle a scream with my pillow. It was more than forgery. It was a macabre theater of betrayal. But as I watched Celeste wipe my father's thumb clean with a wet wipe, I felt a surge of cold, dark empowerment. I had the ghost witness. I had the one thing that Celeste said didn't exist, a testimony from the dead. I realized that if I went to the police immediately, Sterling's high-priced lawyers would find a way to suppress the evidence or claim it was an illegal recording. No, I needed to play the long game. I needed to let them think they were untouchable until the very moment the trap snapped shut. I spent the rest of the night making 3 encrypted backups of the footage and hiding them in places they would never look, 1 in my father's old tackle box in the garage, and 2 in cloud accounts they didn't know existed. I wasn't Juniper the victim anymore. I was the architect of their destruction, and the hidden secrets of the sunroom were about to become their prison. The silent plan was a masterclass in tactical patience. In the high-stakes world of Texas estate law, a direct confrontation is a losing battle if your opponent has the resources to bury you in motions and countersuits. I knew that Celeste and Sterling felt invincible, and that was their greatest vulnerability. In the USA, the legal system relies heavily on the chain of custody and the finality of probate. If I struck too early, they would claim the footage was AI-generated or an invasion of privacy. I needed them to commit fully to their lie under the most formal circumstances possible. I needed them to walk into a courtroom and swear, under the penalty of perjury, that my father had been lucid and eager to sign those papers. Step 1 was the submission. I stopped fighting. I apologized to Celeste for my outbursts and told Sterling he was right. I wasn't cut out for the oil business. This was the hardest part of the plan, looking into the eyes of the people who had desecrated my father's body and smiling. I began packing my things into U-Haul boxes, making sure to do it in the grand foyer where they could see my defeat. This inflated Sterling's ego to a dangerous level. He became so confident that he stopped hiding his tracks, openly discussing his plans to liquidate my father's slow growth assets to fund a massive, high-risk real estate development in North Dallas. He was moving fast, and I needed him to move even faster. Step 2 was the legal tether. I hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator, but I didn't hire them in Dallas. I went to an old friend of my father's in Houston, a man who loathed Celeste and had seen Sterling for the vulture he was since he was a teenager. We didn't file a lawsuit yet. Instead, we filed a request for extraordinary inventory in the probate court. In the USA, this is a strategic move that forces the executors to list every single asset, every transfer, and most importantly, the witnesses to those transfers. I knew Celeste would use the same corrupt notary who had been on call for her socialite events for years. By forcing them to name their witnesses early, I was locking them into a story they couldn't change once the ghost witness appeared. Step 3 was the digital fortification. I knew that once the footage went public, my life would be a whirlwind of legal firestorms. I spent my nights in the shadows of the estate's guest house, which I had moved into temporarily. I used a secure, encrypted laptop to track Sterling's financial movements. He was already borrowing against the refinery deeds, the ones he had forged the thumbprints for. He was using the stolen assets as collateral for a $20 million loan from a private equity firm. This was perfect. In the USA, financial elder abuse combined with mortgage fraud moves a case from a civil dispute into the realm of federal felonies. I was no longer just looking at a probate fight. I was looking at a RICO case. The mystery and suspense grew as the final probate confirmation hearing approached. This was the date when the judge would officially certify the deeds and the will, making the theft permanent. The night before the hearing, I received a call from my investigator. He had found the third man in the room, a medical assistant Celeste had bribed to keep his mouth shut about the timing of my father's death. He was the weak link. I didn't confront him. I simply had my lawyer send him a subpoena for deposition, along with a still frame image from the nanny cam. We didn't show him the video, we just showed him his own face, standing in the doorway while Sterling held my father's hand. He flipped within 2 hours. The tactical planning was now complete. I had the video, the whistleblower, the paper trail of the fraudulent loans, and 2 arrogant villains who thought they were walking into a coronation. I had prepared a digital evidence package for the district attorney, but I instructed my lawyer to hold it until the exact moment Celeste signed the verification of truth in open court. In the USA, there is a specific satisfaction in the Perry Mason moment, but in real life, it's about the point of no return. Once she signed that document, she wouldn't just be a thief, she would be a felon. I sat in the guest house on the final night, the Dallas heat finally breaking into a thunderstorm. The lightning illuminated the main estate, a house built on my father's sweat and now occupied by his betrayers. Tomorrow, the ghost witness would speak, and the silence of the sunroom would finally be broken. The morning of the final probate confirmation was a study in Texas high society theater. The courtroom was a sea of dark wood and stifling tradition, filled with the who's who of Dallas, friends of my father who had come to see the Thorne Empire officially handed over to the next generation. Celeste arrived looking like a Greek tragedy in couture, her black lace veil draped perfectly over her shoulders. Sterling walked beside her, his chest puffed out, already acting like the owner of the city. They didn't even look at me as I sat at the small petitioner's table with my lawyer, Marcus. To them, I was just a formality, a ghost of a daughter who was about to be legally exorcised from her own heritage. The judge, a formidable man named Henderson, called the case to order. "We are here to finalize the distribution of the estate of Elias Thorne," he announced, his voice echoing in the hallowed space. "The court has before it a codicil and several deed transfers bearing the thumbprint of the deceased. Mrs. Thorne, as executor, do you swear that these documents were executed by your husband in his final hours of lucidity, and that his thumbprint was given freely and knowingly?" Celeste stood up, her voice trembling with a rehearsed, fragile grief. "I do, Your Honor. Elias wanted to make sure his son was protected. It was his final wish." She leaned down and signed the verification of truth with a flourish of her gold pen. Sterling smiled, leaning back in his chair, his eyes already on the horizon of his new billionaire life. "Your Honor," my lawyer Marcus stood up, his voice cutting through the smug silence of the room like a jagged blade. "Before the court certifies these documents, we have a witness to present. A witness that was in the room at 1:14 a.m. on the night of Mr. Thorne's passing." Celeste let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "That's impossible. We were the only ones there." Marcus didn't flinch. "Exactly, Mrs. Thorne, and you weren't alone." He signaled to the court technician, and the lights dimmed. The large screens on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The room went deathly silent. On the screen, the grainy but clear footage of the sunroom played. The timestamp was visible in the corner. The audience gasped as they watched the grieving widow and the devoted son enter the room. The camera captured everything. The way Sterling grabbed my father's limp, blue-tinged hand, the way Celeste held the purple ink pad, the way they mechanically pressed his thumb onto the paper, moving his dead weight as if he were a piece of meat. My father's eyes were half open, glazed and vacant. It was a scene of such profound desecration that a woman in the front row actually burst into tears. Celeste's face in the courtroom went from a mask of grief to a mask of horror, her skin turning the color of ash. Sterling tried to stand up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The hidden secrets were no longer hidden. As the video ended, the whistleblower medical assistant was led into the room by two bailiffs. He pointed directly at Celeste and Sterling. "They told me he was still alive," he choked out. "They paid me $20,000 to look the other way while they fixed the paperwork, but he was already cold." The judge's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't even wait for emotion from my lawyer. "Bailiffs," he thundered, "secure the room. No one leaves." The downfall was swift and absolute. Because the documents Celeste had just sworn were freely given were now proven to be forged through the desecration of a corpse, the judge immediately invalidated the entire codicil. But the legal consequences were just beginning. The district attorney, who had been sitting in the back of the room, stepped forward with a team of investigators. "Celeste Thorne, Sterling Thorne," he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence, "you are under arrest for financial elder abuse, grand larceny, and perjury." In the USA, the desecration of a body for financial gain is a high-level felony. As the handcuffs clicked around Celeste's manicured wrists, the social standing she had spent her life building evaporated in an instant. The socialites she had brunch with only yesterday turned their heads in disgust as she was led out of the courthouse in tears. The public humiliation was total. By that evening, the ghost witness video had been leaked to the local news. The Thorne name, which my father had built on integrity, was dragged through the mud of their greed. Sterling's private equity loan was immediately recalled, and because he had used forged deeds as collateral, he was hit with federal mortgage fraud charges. He didn't just lose the inheritance, he lost his freedom. He and Celeste were denied bail, the judge citing them as flight risks with access to offshore accounts. They went from a North Dallas mansion to a concrete cell in the Lou Sterrett Justice Center overnight. I moved back into the Maine estate the following week. I didn't stay long, though. The purging of energy my mother had talked about was something I actually performed. I sold the estate to a nonprofit that turns large properties into homes for foster children. I took over my father's company, not as a puppet, but as the CEO. The board of directors, initially skeptical, saw the way I had dismantled the fraud and realized I was exactly like the man who built the firm. I moved into a modern, sunlit penthouse in the heart of Dallas, a place that didn't smell of perfume or cigar smoke, but of fresh air and new beginnings. I often think about that night in the sunroom. The ghost witness didn't just save my inheritance, it saved my father's soul from being a footnote in their greed. I finally found the piece I was looking for. I am Juniper Thorn, and I proved that in the end, no matter how much limestone you bury a secret under, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. I moved on, empowered and free, knowing that the real legacy my father left me wasn't the oil fields. It was the strength to stand alone in the dark until the light finally broke through. If you were shocked by the ghost witness reveal, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, what's the craziest family secret you've ever uncovered? I want to hear your stories. Don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Secrets for more tales where the truth is never truly buried. See you in the next one.